In this video, my goal was to create a system of water tiles that could be used to show rivers of any width and natural varying shapes, as well as being able to show wide coastlines or lakesides in a realistic, immersive way. Welcome to the archive, my name's Matt. The core of the system are the straight tiles and the deep water sections. These can be used together to show all kinds of water terrain on a simple level, but can also be left with gaps for certain other terrain that I've planned in future. Even now, you can use stair blocks and city tiles to make a basic bridge over a river, though I've got more planned for this sort of thing. Corners are obviously an awesome way to add realistic curves to the build, and I decided to mix larger and smaller corners with both sharp and gentle curves. Both of these can be combined to transform a narrow flowing stream into a broader, deeper river with midstream islands, or even to a lake's edge or coastline with large areas of rippling water. And of course you can use these with any of my existing landscape tiles to show water in grasslands, mountains, caves, cities, or even more in the future. Now, if you're worried about resin being expensive,
I got waves.
All these tiles cost less than half as much as you probably think they do. But even so, this system works perfectly well no matter what you make it from. You can do the water from paper towels and glue, and while it won't look the same, it'll still make a perfectly flexible set of tiles for use at your table. I even made a special flatter template for anybody who wants to do this instead of the resin. Everyone should be able to make things, regardless of your budget. Other than that, there are a fair few other features to this, including magnetic tufts, bushes, and other accessories, but I'll get to all of that later in the video. To get started, I cut a ton of XPS tiles for the sizes I needed. There's a complete list in the pinned comment. Basically, for the deep water tiles, I would cut them from 1-inch foam if you can, though you can layer them using 1/2-inch foam like I've shown here. While for the water bank tiles, whether straight or corners, you want 1/2-inch thick base tiles for the magnets to sit in and 1-inch thick pieces to cut to shape and glue on top. I also did some variant deep tiles, which are basically just the 1/2-inch thick tile with pure resin on top. These are optional, but they let you do cool things like have shoals of fish in your water, or have islands that you can see beneath the waves as well as on top. Before gluing the relevant pieces together, I added magnets to line up with the magnetic tile system that I've shown in many other videos. For the deep tiles, these are really easy, and just placed around the bottom on all sides. The banks are slightly different, because we want to be able to attach dirt tiles to the back of them to extend out that riverbank if we want to, so the magnets at the back need to be at the top of the bank, not on the base tile. The sides and front magnets are still on the bottom though. It's pretty much the same as what I did for my hill tiles. To make sure it all lined up here, I used a free printed template that you can download on my Patreon to draw a slope onto both sides, and then cut across with a knife to make it roughly level with the template across the back. I did make exceptions here, letting some areas bulge out and carving others deeper in. I did this in opposing pairs where possible to give the river some waviness even without corners. But bear in mind, real rivers have some pretty wonky shapes, so don't worry too much about making perfect smooth curves, because nature sure as hell doesn't. The water's edge will run somewhere about 1 inch from the edge at the top, and if you want to get a feel for where that will be on the tiles, where you give it a bulge or a dip, you can run your thumb, which I believe is actually where the inch measurement came from, along the edge of the tile. You'll feel the dips and bulges and see where the waterline will bend. I also made a less steep template which you can use to reduce the amount of resin that you use, and a completely flat template for using toilet paper methods, which are also available for free on my Patreon. At this point I hot glued them to the base tiles, sliding them a little bit while the glue was hot to thin the gap between tiles as much as possible, and otherwise just making sure that they lined up at the edge, pressing down firmly on top. Once you've got them roughly aligned to the templates, now it's time to start messing with them. I made sure every bank had some kind of interesting curved groove in it, somewhere that could be a muddy overhang with riverbed stones deposited on the flatter section beneath. I did this in a semi-random pattern, also doing some along the higher bank that would become the water's edge, giving some areas of water a sloped beach of dirt, rocks or riverbed stones, and others a jagged muddy edge where the water had been chipping away at the earth. Don't worry about over-trimming either. If at any point you think you've cut back too far and you want to add some bulk back, you can do that at any point using modelling compound to build those bulges back in. Once your foam underlayer is at a place that you're happy with, you want to seal it thoroughly with Mod Podge on all sides other than the bottom, including the deep tiles. Sealing the edges is more important on these pieces because of the resin pores later. Any large gaps on the side of the foam, I'd fill with hot glue and then either flatten down with the nozzle or trim down with a knife. This is more of a just-in-case measure, but it made me feel better. I then gave the banks a coat of brown paint just in case any ended up showing through. On to textures. Once dry, I wanted to add some uneven natural lumpiness, technical term, to the waterbed and bank, and also add some hefty rocks and rocky areas. I like to use a mix of glue and my dirt grout mix for this. In my basing video, I showed how to mix this using PVA, which works but occasionally cracks when drying in thicker areas. This isn't so much of a big deal when you're going to be covering it with dry dirt or other texture like I'm going to be doing here, but I thought it was worth mentioning that you can stop this by using Mod Podge instead. I applied this to pretty much the entire build except for the deep tiles. On the waterbed itself, I dabbed a line along the bank, imitating the lines in the earth made by coastal waves or the flow of the river. On the bank, I shifted technique and used a more random dabbing technique to show a surface impacted by the constant foot traffic of living creatures and the uneven dirt buildup of decomposing plant materials. Decomposing plant materials, didn't you? Click on a fun video. I also used the escarpments that I carved out earlier to make muddy overhangs. I made these generally less extreme underwater, as they'd be more likely to get smoothed out. I also added some plant roots to the bank while the mud was wet. I was sent these by Diorama Precipitate. They're pre-sterilized in the oven and have some color tints added, which is useful if you're looking for a time saver. Oh, and if you find that your mix is too thick or thin after applying, you can just sprinkle on some more grout or spray some water from a spray bottle respectively. This entire mud section is highly optional. It is quite time consuming and it mainly shows on the upper bank areas and the areas around the rocky patches. So I'd maybe limit efforts to those areas for your builds, save yourself some time. For some banks I added plaster rocks, which I cast and stained using the same technique from the caverns video, but I refined it a little bit. I've been working on this for some time and I think I'm nearing a reliable realistic result. I'll include that full realistic result when I've finalized it. I don't think it's quite there yet. Adding these is really easy. You literally just sink them into the mud wherever you want them. You can do the same thing with real rocks. Here I used a mix of Geek Gaming base ready large rocks and some 20mm limestone tarmac. The former is very varied in colour, but the latter is cheaper. Basically, I wouldn't use the Geek Gaming stuff en masse, but it is good for adding texture and colour variety in a realistic way. For larger rocky areas like this, I added some 10mm limestone tarmac in a similar way, making a rocky beach and adding tactical interest to the area by making it difficult terrain even on the bank. I also added some interesting features to the waterbed, including a skeleton that I 3D printed from this month's sponsor, Epic Miniatures. Printing minis for D&D can feel a bit like
build me a army worthy of Mordor.
We don't have the moon!
Which is why I love Epic Miniatures. I honestly genuinely believe that they're one of the best value for money D&D Patreons out there, and I genuinely choose to support them myself. They make an insane number of high quality minis every month.
But my lord, there is no such force.
And they always seem to include classic D&D monsters loyal to the source artwork, to the extent that as a D&D player, I've always felt like I've got my money's worth every month. The sheer variety in each release, and the fact that they give you 2 full backdated releases as a bonus every month, means that before long, you've got a huge range of your main monster needs absolutely covered. This, combined with the fact that he always releases multiple poses for the minis, is an absolute godsend for a DM. Oh, and on top, he regularly releases bonus sets free to existing patrons, everything from rat and rabbit folk to Halloween sets to these awesome villager minis. Thank you to Epic Miniatures for supporting the channel, and seriously, go check it out. Sponsorship or not, I use this, and I can highly recommend it. To get the skeleton to fit, I just dug a nice hole in the foam and caked it in mud, basically the same technique as for the plaster rocks. His arm I snapped off and laid beside him in the mud, after which he lies forgotten and forlorn at the water's edge. Anyway, I added a few more cool features like this, including a lost crown, and a variety of skulls from the Citadel Skulls box making some grim scenes underwater, and several fish. All of these I 3D printed from 3 sources, which I've scaled for our miniatures and supported reasonably well. These are available for free on my Patreon. I thought I'd save you guys scaling and supporting them yourselves. I will say these little visual extras were a little bit hit and miss. The skeleton was great, the fish were good but forced me to use a little bit more resin than I would have liked, and the skulls and crown were basically no longer really visible. I'd just stick to a corpse and maybe use some fish on the banks where the resin depth is cheaper. While the dirt was wet, I sprinkled on some dry dirt grout mix around the rocks and brushed off the excess once it was, well, dry. This means we don't need to carefully get a glue brush between those rocks later. Obviously I did all of this tile by tile, a small patch at a time, and as I'm hoping should be equally obvious right now, you can make this a lot simpler for your own builds if you want to. It'll still look really cool even if it's just dirt and pebbles. Once dry, I added some small iron nails to various points along the bank where I wanted to be able to add grass tufts and bushes at a later date. These just about work for attaching tufts, but 3mm magnets buried in there will do a much better job for attaching things like bushes. It really depends on how many extra magnets you're willing to use. I used a sculpting tool with a little magnet on the end to add these more easily. I covered these over with some more mud mix and marked where they were on the underside. Once covered by the final layers, you can use these connection points to add life to a riverbank above ground, while leaving it barren and grim for caves or more evil-tainted areas. Making the magnetic tufts is really easy. I made some rough, slightly smaller than tuft-sized blobs using milliput over a 3mm magnet. Once dry, I could cut it down if needed, paint it brown, and just add the tuft on top. Bushes are similar, but with these I first superglued the bush to the magnet at an angle that I liked, and then added a thin layer of mud around it. You don't really need much, this stuff is hard as nails, actually harder than milliput. In fact, I'd recommend using this stuff instead of milliput anywhere where you need a little bit of filler, but you don't need to sculpt it precisely. I try to keep the mud close to the bush so it looks like it's gathered against the plant and looks more natural. Adding some PVA and dry dirt on top helps with this. You can store these on a magnetic sheet like this, or on your fridge, though that may raise questions. You can also use this method on the roadside bushes that I showed in my roads video, or to make overgrown looking buildings using the Patreon upgraded magnetic walls, just like I show with cocktail sticks for the original wall design. Oh, and in case you're interested, there is a new bonus video coming soon showing smooth connecting mountain blocks that use minimal magnets and have no gaps, along with a bunch of other upgrade videos on Patreon. With those in place, I added my final layers over some PVA glue, first by sprinkling some dirt grout mix onto the overhanging escarpments. For these final layers of dirt grout mix, I also used the version from the basing video, where I also mixed in Geek Gaming Forest Path for more variety and occasional small stones. With that in place, I was free to cover over the bulk of the underwater areas with Geek Gaming Riverbed mix, without it sticking to said overhangs. Further up, different banks got different finishes, and a nice trick here is to write on the underside of each tile what finish you have planned for it, which helps you stay organised and not overdo one type. Obviously the limestone rock banks were mostly done, but for the others I went with one of two options. On half I added my dirt and grout mix, blending in where I faded out with the riverbed mix. On the other half I continued the riverbed mix further up the bank to make a beach of small stones. Either way, I left the edge of each piece on the bank as dirt, roughly up to the water's edge, where I blended it into more of that riverbed mix for the underwater areas. Using dirt on the edges of all of the banks basically means there's no sharp edges when we connect them together, so they all work smoothly in any combination. Then, while the glue was still wet, I added a final sprinkling of the plain dirt grout mix, the stuff without the forest path mixed in, over the riverbed mix, basically to sink into all of the cracks between the stones and make it look more natural, dusting it off with a makeup brush when dry. Finally, I sealed the above water bank area with my usual scenic sealant mixture. I made sure to only hit the bank, or at least only hit the shallows of the water, by blocking the spray with some paper. I did 2 layers here to start with, but you can add more after you've added the resin just by blocking the resin with some paper to add some extra durability. It is very important to seal the above water area though, otherwise the resin will creep up the bank into the grout. Don't worry too much if it does creep up though, you can just add more riverbed mix and grout on top before you add the ripples. Finally, to add to my little perspective trick, I shaded the bottom of the bank with black ink, making it more or less solid black up to a 1/4 inch from the edge, and then blending this into the bank with some raw umber ink. I did both of these through an airbrush, but thinning the inks and applying by brush should work well enough. With that done, I could safely add my little fish, which I made little pillars for out of UV resin under UV light, starting with a flat line on parchment paper, and then putting that upright on some blue tack and dribbling resin onto it while under the light, so it cured as it dribbled. I cut this pillar to fit and then cured the fish to it with a dab more UV resin, before curing it to the bank in a deep area with a bit more UV resin. The fish itself I painted Vallejo metal colour silver and added some army painted dark tone shading to the top, eyes and fins. And that's that. The exact mix of texture, features, and how I laid them out on banks are briefly on screen here, so you can pause and steal ideas for your own builds. The islands were done in a similar but slightly different way. I used 2 methods. For the first, I added some bulk in the rough shape of the island I wanted in 1/2 inch foam, and then coated it in the PVA mud mix, and pushed in lots of 20mm limestone tarmac. This stuff is basically the same as the smaller rocks, only bigger. There's links to examples of both in the equipment list. I sprinkled dirt and grout mix over the mud while it was still wet, saving me some glue and getting it into the nooks more easily. For the large island, I did the same thing, but with 2 plaster rocks on top of the rough cut foam, blended together with mud and with dirt laid over it. Once they were both dry, I drilled a hole in one of the larger patches of mud and added a 6x4mm magnet with superglue, covering it with more mud and dirt and aiming to keep a large area around the magnet basically flat. I also added more nails for tufts and bushes. The corners were made in a similar way, but with some differences here and there. They're designed specifically to split neatly into 2 sections to allow them to be rivers or coasts and to widen the corners at will. I also made some new side attachments for cave and grassland tiles to make them look nicer at the edges of the rivers, or on the edges of mountain blocks for that matter. They also add a nice curve to otherwise quite square corners. The extra layout of these, including templates and a full bonus video on making these optional extras, is now up on Patreon as a thank you to my patrons. To finish this off, we'll need the bit that you've all been waiting for, the resin. Now, a lot of people think that resin is very expensive, and while that is kind of true, it's probably a lot less expensive than you think, at least in most countries. There are a ton of ways to get resin cheaper that I've condensed down into a free public resource on my Patreon that also includes links to sources of cheap resin in the UK, US, and several other countries. If you find resin in your country at a good price like this, and I don't already have it listed, link it to me and I'll check it out. Oh, and because some of you asked for it, there's also a bonus video showing and talking about my failed experiments in a bit more detail. When using these methods or sources, resin is literally 1/3 of the cost that it can appear to be on a quick Google or Amazon search, or even less. At this price, a pint glass of resin, which is the size that you'll often see used, about 250ml, is only about £2.50. Hardly extortionate. Overall on this project, you'd probably use somewhere between £25 and £50 worth of resin, depending on how many of the resin reducing tricks that I've shown that you use. Granted, this isn't as cheap as cardboard, foam, or paper towels, but it does look a lot better, I think. But if you absolutely don't want to use resin, you can use multiple layers of about 1/8 of an inch thick gloss Mod Podge, but this will probably have bubbles. I've got a complete list of how to use less resin and ripple material in the pinned comment, so check that out if you're interested. Anyway, material options aside, let's get to the mechanics. You've got a few options here. There is a strong and, in my opinion, fairly convincing argument for using the cheapest, smooth, rigid, non-porous material for this. This test tile I did with 2mm styrene. It came with 2 rough edges, and this left this unappealing edge, but works fine when connected as light doesn't really travel between the tiles anyway. Obviously, this means you can't look in at the edge, which is fun for a lot of people. So I'm going to show you some other options in case you want to preserve that ability. You can dam the edges with either styrene or acrylic. Styrene is cheaper, but as I said, it often arrives scratched or rough and is not exactly glossy. And no matter what, the surface of each type will probably get a bit damaged after being used a few times. To avoid this, what I did was make only a few from styrene, enough for a batch of tiles, and then superglue them thoroughly to cheap overhead projector acetate sheets, face down like this. Once dry, you can then cut them out, trim the edges on the right angled edges, and voila! Smooth-sided damming pieces that leave a glossy finish on the side of your resin, and can be reused for the next batch just by supergluing to a new sheet of acetate if needed, after trimming the wreckage of the last batch off, of course. You could make this even cheaper by using thick, rigid packaging card instead of styrene. Apparently you can also use foam core with a plastic coating, though I don't have access to that here, so I'm going to have to take the word for it. One thing you do want to do is make sure that the acetate is always on the side with the right angle in the same corner, either all bottom left or all bottom right, so they can all tessellate together. Easy mistake to make. If you are worried about this, the Patreon Discord is a great place to get specific advice, share projects, get ideas, and talk to me directly. It's busy pretty much every day. When cutting the styrene, I want to make sure at least one corner is right angled, and marked off where I wanted the waterline before adding the acetate, so that the ink won't bleed into the resin. This means when assembling the dams on the tile, you can start by aligning this right angle to the bottom and side of the tile, sealing it at the bottom with a thick, wide layer of hot glue. Once cool, you can then place your next piece, using that right angle at the edge to push the overhanging end bit into to make sure that the angle is 90 degrees from tile to top. And again, seal with hot glue at the bottom, but also between the two pieces with an extra blob at the join just to be sure. Using the previous dam to keep the right angle straight like this means you've got less to focus on. It also helps you apply more pressure to the middle, which helps avoid bulging, oversized tiles that don't quite fit. I do this for all corners on deep tiles and all water touching corners on the banks. Honestly, while this did work, it was a lot of work just to get those glossy edges for cheaper. The acrylic is probably the way to go if you want glossy, and styrene if you don't really care that much. This halfway house works and is great for using cheap rigid card, but ask yourself how much you want that glossy edge. While pouring the resin, I did it on these silicone pet food mats that I have for 3D printing, but you could just use thick card or thick newspaper. The key here is making sure that all of the edges are turned up or sealed. A line of hot glue around the edge of card can be good for this as a cheap option. For the resin itself, my resin was one of those non-1-to-1 ratio resins, which are often cheaper. These are incredibly easy to use with 5 minutes of prep. If you grab a plastic cup the same size as you were going to use, you can measure out water to the amounts that you need for each part, resin and hardener, and then mark it off on the side with a pen. You can see here I've done it a few times for larger and smaller batches of resin. Then when mixing, just place the cups side by side and draw on the line at the height that you need for that cup, and pour away. Perfect results every time. For mixing resin with minimal bubbles, I've thrown together a detailed guide in the pinned comment to save time in the video. But here's the real secret with that. It doesn't matter if you get some bubbles. These tiles I made were not bubble free, and they look awesome from the playing angle. Even when looking down through the water, because of the shadows, you can see underwater detail, but you don't really see many bubbles. And there are a lot more than it looks like. Check out this view with a light behind it. For all tile types, I started by adding a very thin layer of clear resin over the areas that would be covered by water. I later decided to do this brush-on layer thinly before adding the dams, and you can see the difference in this early tile on the right and later tile on the left. The main reason I did this was to draw the bubbles out early in a thin layer, that I could then easily remove with a torch after letting them all rise. I left mine for about half an hour because the working time of my resin was about 45 minutes. If your resin's working time is a lot faster, leave it for less time. This trick requires a sacrifice to the god of crafting. For the deep tiles, once this thin layer cures, you can then also tint the next layer of resin heavily with black ink to further obscure the surface. I actually didn't do this thin brush-on layer for my first deep tiles. I reasoned that the black ink layer would act as the thin layer and hide the bubbles. It did not. For the banks, I did the first layer the same with a thin layer by brush, making sure most of the underwater bit was covered. With this layer done and cured, I moved on to my coloured resin layers. For this, I did a ton of experimentation, but in the end, I found that a 6:4:1 mix of raw umber, carbon black, and blue Liquitex inks did an amazing job of getting a realistic, slightly tinted, but not slimy, dirty-looking watercolour. I found this easiest to do by laying out the inks in a palette and dipping a cocktail stick in, wiping it in the resin, and then wiping on paper towels. Rinse, repeat. Be very careful with the blue. I found it best to give the final little dip of blue after everything else if it needs it. It is far more powerful than the other two and can tint the whole colour very quickly with a single dip too many. I did this in the ratio 6:4:1 and built up the strength of colour until it matched my text mix under the light. And then we can pour. Again, I've included a detailed guide in the pinned comment with some extra tips. But the bottom line is I did this in 2 thinner layers, each getting halfway to the height of the waterline. This made it far easier for bubbles to rise properly before the resin cured, as the distance was less. I poured the second layer 6 hours after the first, which was what my resin recommended. Yours might differ. The bubbles will take a while to rise, like I said earlier, so I found it best to pour them all, then play with bubbles. I'd leave all of that to cure for at least 24 hours with paper over it to keep the dust off. Longer if you can. The longer you leave it, the easier it will be to peel away the sides without damaging the resin. Peeling it is as simple as using a knife to cut away the hot glue from the bottom and the sides, and then gently prying the styrene off. Once done, you can trim down the sharp edges with a sharp knife. We'll be covering over this anyway later with ripples. This is the awesome trick that means that tiles just blend together seamlessly, and is also very durable for minis to be used on. Even large ships should be fine on this. I used Woodland Scenic's water ripples for this effect, because it's ready mixed, it's faster, and it guarantees a nice finish. Another alternative is gloss Mod Podge, though this needs to be far thinner and spread by blowing with a straw or airbrush. I am aware that Luke showed how to do similar stuff with Clearfix, but that has major downsides, mainly that it's horribly prone to bubbles and generally harder and slower to use. But it is a method that allows similar ripples for cheaper. I've included a link in the pinned comment in case anyone wants to try it. Applying the ripples is really easy. I used a silicone sculpting tool to avoid adding bubbles, but you can use a brush, and I did on my test pieces. I applied a layer about 2 to 3 millimeters thick. This takes about 5 minutes per 3-inch square area, and that is important for a reason. This stuff takes about 10 to 20 minutes, depending on how thick it is, to stop self-leveling and be gel-like enough to make proper ripples with. Basically, I just jab the stuff repeatedly.
Jabby, jabby, jab, jab, jab.
In multiple directions, keeping it random. This gives you a gorgeous looking finish and makes our tile connections almost invisible. I am very happy with the result of this. It's exactly what I was aiming for, and I'm glad I was able to take the time to test and experiment properly. It definitely led to a better result for you guys to try. So thank you again to my patrons. Without their support, creators like me would be much more reliant on ads and sponsors. It's not the easiest project to work on, and I would advise leaving this one until you're confident in your crafting abilities. I've been putting this one off a bit just to make sure I knew more or less what I was doing before diving in. But as a crowning achievement of your collection, these pieces are amazing, and better than most crowning achievements, will actually get used regularly in a game rather than sitting on a shelf. Please subscribe, like, comment and share, and until next time, I'll be in the archive.